Hello, everyone. Welcome
Hey,
to another edition of the Rabbit House Press Author Spotlight. My name's Erin Chandler, and I'm here with Kristin Minter, and we are from Rabbit House Press. We're here with author Kyle Alvey today, and we have just put out his poetry collection on Low Gap Road. In case you all don't know, we're a small publishing company out of Versailles, Kentucky, but Kristin is joining from Yardley, Pennsylvania. And Kyle is joining from Ashland, Kentucky. So I'm going to read just a little bit about the book we're going to talk about in introducing Kyle on Low Gap Road. Kristin, will you hold the book up? Kyle, will you hold the book up? On Low Gap Road. Yay! Get your copy at rabbithousepress.com. Okay. Um, I am going to introduce Kristin, our new author liaison, more in a minute, but I wanted to first introduce this book. On Low Gap Road is a representation of Kentucky life in the 20th and 21st centuries. Kyle Alvey's poetry honors a life of simplicity, work, and family. The poet explores aspects of childhood living on a tobacco farm in Appalachia, making the connection between different types of Kentuckians. Now, I went to Spalding University, which I adore, and one of the founders of Spalding, Karen Mann, wrote this about on Low Gap Road. If you, like me, grew up on a farm or visited your grandparents' farm, then On Low Gap Road by Kyle Robert Alvey will bring alive your most cherished childhood memories. Through this book of heartfelt scenes and vignettes, Alvey recognizes where and who we come from and how we can best keep our family narratives alive. Karen Mann, who wrote The Woman of La Mancha and The Saved Man. So what did you think about that when you got that wonderful review from Karen Mann?
I was very appreciative. I love Karen. She and I have been in a we'll have to revive it sometime, but we've been in a fantasy and sci-fi writing group in the past. So that's how I came to know Karen. But I love her. She's great.
I saw that you mostly write fantasy and sci-fi.
Mhm.
That's interesting. That's interesting. And when did you start doing that?
In terms of connecting like with other Kentucky authors, that dabble in sci-fi and fantasy, it was really kind of the year or two before COVID, and joining with the Carnegie Center's online writing classes.
Right.
Uh, then my time at UK, I spent some time writing with different people. Um, and I mean, sci-fi and fantasy, that was kind of my gateway into, being an English major and loving reading. It kind of took those fun stories of sci-fi and fantasy in my childhood and reading all those. That's really what it kind of guided me on the path of, teaching English and loving literature and all those things.
So where do you, I want to ask Kristen, I know that you've been sort of reading and editing another, we're about to do a sci-fi book. What is the name of that book, Kristen?
Oh, the band, the
Max Langfield's.
it is called In the Raven Shadow. But I have a question. What prompted you to write such a personal book of poetry?
I just really wanted to kind of honor my grandparents. They both passed away when I was in high school. And this is just kind of a reflection on their life and also their life through the perspective of hearing stories about them from my mother and other family members. Because I feel like I mean, I knew them, of course, but like only seeing them 4 or 5 times a year, I didn't have that close of a relationship that I wish I could have had. And I think my grandparents and I would have had a lot in common, if I had been able to know them as an adult. I think we're pretty like-minded people. And so, and kind of, and teaching at the same school where they kind of ended their teaching careers.
That
Uh,
is, talk about that just for
Oh,
a
okay.
minute. In Berea, you have a picture in the book of them at Berea College, and when they were leaving, but the school that you're teaching now
Mhm.
is where they ended their careers, and where is that?
So I teach at Greenup County High School, which is just in Greenup County, which Greenup County is really close to where Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia meet. Um, and so yeah, there were three high schools back in the 70s. There was Greenup High School, there was Wortland High School, and McKell High School. And my grandparents, I believe, taught. I know my grandfather taught at Wortland. I don't really know about my mamaw. I'm not entirely sure. Um, and the schools consolidated, so they formed Greenup County High School, and they were on the first faculty teaching there back in 73, 74, somewhere in there.
Wow.
Um, and my grandfather, he was an ag teacher, and a farmer, and he lasted one semester. I don't think it was the same as his Portland High School. He wasn't quite in control as he wanted to be, I guess. I don't know the full story there. But
Mm.
then he retired from teaching and went and had like a 10 or 15 year long career. My mom would know this. So I think Armco or one of the some industry something around here. I'm not entirely sure. But that kind of so by the time I came around, they had been retired from teaching for 25 years. So
And
I
you
never,
were teaching for you have your MFA, you have your master's in I was just looking at that. You have
yeah, I
your
have a master's in English. So after I finished at my undergrad, I did a master's in English. Then I
from the
went and did
University of Kentucky. You got your bachelor's from the University of Kentucky, and then English and secondary teaching.
yes. And now I'm finishing up. I have to write my history thesis this next academic year.
Fascinating. So you're
Finishing,
getting an MA in history at Marshall University right now, currently?
yes. Yep.
Wow.
So this next academic year, I'll just have to write my thesis, and then that'll be done. So done
So
with all the
so
courses.
history, so sci-fi and history. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and I think literature and history are so intertwined. They definitely the methodologies between the two disciplines are totally different. I've gotten used now to footnotes and endnotes and that sort of thing. Uh,
Uh-huh.
and I'm no longer a paying dues member of MLA like I was for a few years there because I've kind of left MLA behind a little bit.
Right, right.
Because there are
Well,
definitely better
I
things.
always leave MLA behind. So, I'm always like, I don't care what it says on that. It looks good to me on the page. Well, would you please read some for us?
Yes.
Gonna
So
make you speaker view, and I'm gonna mute Kristen and
Erin, I think you may have muted yourself. You're good.
oh, I did mute myself. I was saying I'm muting Kristen and I for a minute so I don't
Okay.
pop in.
Okay. All right. So the book is kind of split up in five sections. The first is the tobacco farm, then the garden and table, then papaw, then mammal, and then lastly life together. And then part six, which is who comes next. And then there's a little collection of vignettes at the end and an epilogue. So for this first reading, I'll read. So you said 5, 7 minutes, so I'll just read a little handful of poems. All right, so this first one is called Tobacco. A sturdy plant that requires more steps than any other to end up in stores and homes, lastly into lungs. Small green plants in styrofoam trays float on algae-covered water, waiting for laborers who cultivate. Plant in the summer with the fiercest sun above, row after row, field after field. Conversations happen in planting season. They continue until brown leaves are stripped away and sent off. Okay. This one's called Childhood Home. Um, and so to kind of preface this a little bit, I grew up in Western Kentucky, just outside, about 40 minutes outside of Owensboro, Kentucky. So pretty much the opposite end of the state. Um, and so living on a tobacco farm there, but then coming up to my grandparents' farm, was definitely always such a large part of my childhood. Just that travel in between. Um, so this one's called next one. In the East. Hours and miles we would travel to reach the garden and the house. down a sloped gravel driveway with small fields on either side. The white house with porch and covered carport, an array of barns and buildings which house the discards of decades of farming. In front, mirroring back home, 3 sturdy apple trees growing green fruit instead of red. The farm sprawls and connects with a gravel road which I spent my childhood walking, often barefoot if the weather allowed. I grew up hearing passed down wisdom, when the month has an R, it is time to put the shoes back on. To the right was a covered swing where I would sit alone, kept company with a book or one of the many Jack Russell Terriers from the enclosed doghouse. Beyond the trees in front was the pond filled with large bass and who knows what else. The cows that used to live here were long gone by my time. Behind the house, down a sharp yet smooth hill, is where it lay, covering an acre or less. And this next one, Simple Fences and the Yield, about my grandfather's garden. The first design was made of twine, with interwoven patterns meant to phase passing deer. Next came wire, barbed and twisted. This protected the garden and potential growth. Last came electric wire, able to zap and sting. If I ever reached out to touch it, I would quickly stumble back. I was taught to raise and lower, to climb over or burrow under. Fences are important for gardens beyond simple protection. They lend themselves to form shape. In this case, a wide square of the yield produced within. The electric fence sings and hums, and the vegetables sit to listen, waiting, though they do not know it, to be picked. And then I want to bring my mama into this conversation. So, you know, what I associate most with her is just eating good food. You know, some homegrown. You know, it might have to
I
go.
need to talk to you about that. I'm so glad you're reading that because it's just like those sections about what she's cooking makes me so hungry. And I want to talk to you about like the difference after you read this about the difference in Appalachian culture and the food and how I was just finishing Crystal Wilkinson's book with all those beautiful recipes and with her mama. And I wanted to talk to you about the food of the region. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. We'll definitely talk about that. I love to eat, so I always pay attention when food's involved. So this next one is called Presented on the Table. All of this fresh produce has been sliced and cut, boiled and mashed, steamed and dried, cubed and diced. She has been working all day preparing for supper because everyone is coming around tonight and will come hungry. She bakes a ham and bread to accompany, and bowls go the vegetables. For dessert is pie or a cake, and when everyone has finished piled up the plates, they thank her by doing the dishes. When she finally gets to recline in her chair, with all of us spread out across a landscape of chairs, floor, and couches, she feels content because the fruits of her labor were delicious, and everyone knows it. And then in the Papal section, I have one called His Hands, and then in the Mama section, I have one called Her Hands, and I'll kind of wrap up this first reading with those two, if that sounds good.
Okay, great.
All right, so His Hands. Rough and calloused, stained with the darkest dirt that comes from years of work. Nails kept short by need, wrinkles running here and there come from years of life. Scars of cuts and distortions of bruises, veins visible within the palms that comes from years of stress. Strong and steady, durable and capable that comes from years of experience. Now it's funny, so I was doing my reading up at the bookstore up in Ashland, and all my aunt and uncles were there, and my mom. And while I was reading that poem, they all stopped and said, "Well, Kyle, his fingernails were always long and dirty. He hated to cut his fingernails." And I'm like, well, these are the type of conversations we needed to have before the book came out. But maybe for a second edition, maybe that would be a change.
I was blabbing and I was muted. But yes, that's so interesting about your memory that you would see his hands like that. And it's very interesting.
And as my mom said then, you know, you would think that they, you know, if you're going to be in dirt all the time, you would think you would keep your fingernails short. But he apparently didn't like to cut his fingernails. And so they would always grow pretty long. So it's fascinating though, the way that we remember things, and sometimes incorrectly. So
Absolutely.
all right, so this next one is called Her Hands. I remember them as wrinkled things resting in her lap or submerged in soapy water. I sat and held them, seeing the veins so close to the surface, as if they were going to break free. She bruised easily, as people tend to do in old age, and I would trace purple smudges, wishing they would go away, being too young to know she had earned them by living a long, fulfilled life. Her hands were strong, her hands were gentle, her hands are the support of my family.
That's
How
one of my favorite poems in the book.
it's beautiful, isn't it? Okay, we can all unmute, and I'm going to um make us all part of the gallery now. Thank you so much, Kyle. I think that and I remember people were asking this when we did the book release at A Likely Story in Midway, that when you're it's very interesting that it's this whole book about growing up with your grandparents when you weren't with them that much, but it shaped your entire childhood.
Right. It was definitely I see this a little bit as imaginative, kind of imagining a little bit of what life would have been like if I'd grown up here. If we were able to kind of have that relationship that I know, because I mean, growing up, I knew friends who, they'd see their grandparents like every day
Right.
and those type of things, and so just kind of imagining, what that would have looked like a little bit.
Because it almost seems like, I mean, on first read, it seems like you grew up with your grandparents and they
Yeah.
were the primary caregiver. And in
Right.
fact, that's not, your mom is like amazing. You're all, I mean, your mom is so sweet. And you didn't, they weren't your primary
Yeah,
caregivers.
yeah, not at all. And really, by the time I'm the youngest of the youngest. So I mean, I have cousins who are, um, probably only 15 years younger than my mom. By the time I came around, they were both definitely retired from working, but Papa still worked on his farm a little bit. But by the time I came around, the cows were gone, chickens were gone, any animals were gone because that.
They were still doing tobacco. It was still a tobacco
Oh, well, actually, so my papa never really did tobacco. He mostly just did vegetables, but then he used to do. He had some beehives back in the back. I wish I had put something in there about that, maybe
Oh.
a second edition. Um,
Now, what about the tobacco barn that you guys are?
so that's back in Owensboro. So I grew up in Owensboro on an actual tobacco
Yeah, I was
farm.
gonna say, isn't that your parents' house where the tobacco farm is? And
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
that's what I
yeah,
thought. Okay.
yeah.
It's so
Uh,
interesting because it's like Bruce Lewis, my cousin who wrote Joshua Fragmented. Have you read that?
I
Joshua?
haven't. I haven't read it yet, but I
Okay,
have.
because he grew up, and that's in between Budapest, because he spent a lot of time in Europe, but it's the beginnings of growing up on a tobacco farm seems in Woodford County seems very different than your growing up on a tobacco farm. And I want to know, I wanted to ask you about how when you talk about the different kinds of Kentuckians and writing about Appalachia and writing about, I mean, maybe it's like you can explain to Kristin what Appalachia is
Yeah.
like living in Pennsylvania, because she's never been to Appalachia and I've only driven through, even though it's parts of my my great grandfather are from Breathitt, from Quicksand, Kentucky. And I've
Mhm.
just driven recently through that. But tell Kristen and whoever else is listening, what Appalachia is like, your Appalachia.
Well, to me, Appalachia, just historically has always been pretty isolated. Historically, it was a place that was difficult to just physically navigate through, and it was kind of difficult to start a
Why?
life here, because there's so many, since there's so many hollers and hills and things. There's just not enough places to have just flat fields, so it could never really
Drive
be.
through and there's like little pockets of places in the mountains and
Yeah, so it became a place that, agriculture was not able to be unlike Western Kentucky, agriculture wasn't able to become kind of the thing that's going to generate money. Um, and so because of that, Appalachia kind of had to turn to, or I guess others had to turn to, like more exploitive resources, like extracting coal and extracting,
Oh,
any and every resource that we could find. And so in my, my history master's degree, one of the classes I took, I wrote a paper about just kind of the exploitative nature of Appalachia, just the history of it. And it's really kind of a post-colonial sense, people coming in and taking out resources and then that wealth leaving Appalachia,
Yeah.
um, which has largely contributed. I mean, West Virginia, which is the only state that's completely in Appalachia, um, is, like one of the poorest states in the US because, I mean, just so much of that wealth that was generated there has been taken out. Um, and so, I think what comes to mind when I think of Appalachia, I definitely think of, just a rich historical culture, and then there's also a level of a self-imposed culture, because one of the books that I read for one of my classes was about people going into Appalachia and thinking that they needed skills like quilt making, and fiddle making and things like that, so they came in and taught them that. So some of these things that we think of as Appalachian were actually just kind of transposed by people who thought that that's what these people like or need to know.
because I was
Interesting.
going to ask you, is there a definition for Appalachian?
So I would kind of see it at this, the region from kind of goes up into Pennsylvania, and kind of comes down parts of New York even, and then comes down completely and covers West Virginia, and then it's this small little sliver of Kentucky, and then down into Virginia. So just the Appalachian Mountains really.
Oh, so it's mostly mountains.
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay.
Appalachian
So
Mountain.
where I live at Ashland, which I really consider Moorhead, which is about 40 minutes from here, that's kind of the end of Appalachia. I think people like to say that Lexington is part of Appalachia. I heartily disagree.
Yeah.
I've heard that from some people, and I'm like, no, not quite.
Right.
Because by the time you get to Moorhead, the mountains have become, for where I live right now, hills are everywhere. Natural hills, not necessarily just man-made hills. But by the time you get to Moorhead, yes, it's very hilly and things, but the steepness has gone down, and you're also a little bit lower.
So when you're talking about the different types of Kentucky, and you say, when we focus on our the things that we're alike, we're better as a community as our differences. And when you say the different kinds of Kentucky, what are you referring to? I know one world is your mama and papa's world, and that is really just this really work and family and rest and work and family and rest and work and family and rest
And warmth and warmth.
and warmth and love.
Yeah.
And what is the other Kentucky that you're talking about?
So I see it as, kind of the split between Eastern and Western. Um, and so I think that there are much more similarities than there are differences, but I think that there are subtle differences between Eastern and Western Kentucky. So just to give you a few examples here, if you went to like a barbecue or a cookout or something in Western Kentucky, back where I grew up, and you walk in with which this may sound weird to both of you, I don't know, but you walk in with your crock pot of hot dog sauce, which I don't know if you both know what that is, but it's basically chili-ish. I would get
You call it
attacked.
hot dog sauce?
Yes, it's called hot. Anytime you go to a barbecue around here, there's going to be a crock pot. It's going to be full of hot dog sauce. You just pop on your hot dog.
So
And
it's like chili.
yes, essentially, but
I'm like, I know what a crock pot is, but I thought hot dog sauce
That's
is.
as far as we go.
but up here, grocery
That
stores,
makes
you
sense.
buy it canned. You can't find it in Western Kentucky. Um, and so that's just one thing that has not that's impacted me slightly, just because going to barbecues and that's what we do. Um, that was one thing that came out to me early is, oh, I say hot dog sauce, and my friends that I grew up with have no idea what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And it's funny, because we're only what 200 miles away, and
Right.
yet enough of a cultural divide that's one of the, and that's a pretty small thing, cuisine, food. but and I think there are others in terms of examples of kind of these differences, but it's very fascinating to think about how just the to go ahead and quote Walt Whitman, the multitudes that Kentucky has. I think there are so many different types of people in Kentucky. And I don't think a lot of us realize that too. 'Cause I think Kentucky is such a complex state, and its history is very complex, and its present and its future I think is going to be complex, because there are so many overlapping realities that are true and valid, and yet they're contradictory at times. Um, and I think that's, I mean, maybe every state's
Can you
like
give
that.
me an example of that?
Yeah, it's
Uh,
really interesting as a historian, to talk to you as a historian about Kentucky because it is, we are in the middle where some people say it's the South, some people say no, it's not the South. Some people say it's this, some people say it's that. Woodford County is very different than Louisville, I mean, and Western Kentucky, and then Appalachia. There've been so many books written about that. There's I don't know if you read the book Woman's Daughter, about there was a um they used to take in the Appalachian Mountains, they used to carry books by horse.
mhm.
And there were a group of people called the Blue People, and they actually had, yeah, I think you
Okay,
knew
I know what you're talking about now. Yeah.
now, and they called because they really had like a hemoglobin, situation that made them blue, but it's in Appalachia. And then, but you see everything up to all these books. We just read Fenton Johnson's Rock, Paper, Scissors about going back to Appalachia with that was a Kentucky Reads Humanities book about, the gathering. Did you read that Rock, Paper, Scissors?
I have not, but I saw you posting about it.
Yeah, I was wondering what you would think about the his Appalachian ancestors.
Yeah, I'll definitely have to give that a read. It's on my list of books to get next time I'm
I
fortunate
think
enough to walk
love
into
it.
a
I
book.
think you really, really love it. And the other book that I'll mention that you and Kristin would both love is my friend Robbie Henson's book. And that oh, holy moly, Loudwater. Loudwater is so good, and it's about a man that just got out of prison and goes back to Appalachia. But the way he describes like the freeways, the highways going through town and the motels right on I'll drive you around there, Kristin, when you come to visit.
Okay.
I'll take you to Eastern Kentucky. And so it'll be really interesting and show Donna because it's totally different than here. And the culture, it's obviously Kyle knows much more than me, but they do have their own, they're so proud of that culture and they should be, but it's very interesting.
And I think there's also with Appalachia, there's a lot of stereotyping that happens. Just in modern media, especially.
Yeah,
This idea of the person standing barefoot on the porch, with a banjo, which is not at all accurate.
right.
Uh,
I
and
don't have that vision of Appalachia, but
that's good.
okay, now I'm starting to get a picture of what you're talking about.
But,
Right.
but and we have I feel like there are
Last
just
time I was there, I did see some people barefoot on a porch and I pulled in the wrong driveway with a couple guns and a banjo. And I was like, wrong turn.
which, to be fair, I mean, I
Yeah.
will spend some time barefoot on the porch later today.
Yeah.
But I'll be reading instead of,
You won't be holding on to a big pistol and
yes, yeah, it won't
don't turn.
Shotgun.
Yeah.
yeah, it won't be that. But to talk about kind of the historical complexities of Kentucky that I'm talking about. So, for example, my master's thesis is about the Civil War era, and I'm writing about Confederate sympathy in Eastern Kentucky, a place that the Confederacy never really held, but yet, this kind of late phenomenon, which of course the phenomenon is after the Civil War, kind of this lost cause
We have
um,
Jenny.
thing. Hey, Jenny. And so,
This is very interesting. This is incredibly interesting that you're, go ahead.
yeah, and so that's kind of what my history thesis is going to be about. But just to kind of give an example of how Kentucky is kind of in the middle of all things. I mean, both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis were born in Kentucky. And so that's we have the multitudes of you know fighting to defend the Union versus fighting to defend the institution of slavery. And Kentucky contains, both of those realities at the same time. And so, I see Kentucky, and there are several, many books out there about Kentucky as a border state, and the role that it played, and continues to play. I think, we have a very red controlled House and Senate, but a Democratic governor. We have, and
We need to run for president.
Andy Bashir needs to run for president.
He
Yes.
needs to run for president.
eventually. Maybe.
People say, Kyle, people say that the best, and this is way before we went into Marjorie Taylor Greene chaos.
Yeah.
But they used to say, the best Republican is a Kentucky Democrat. How did they say that?
I don't know if I've heard that, but that's fascinating because I think a lot of the way that I understand politics in Kentucky and just kind of the history of politics, a lot of Kentucky's way of doing things was about economic policies and largely kind of ignored the cultural issues. I think that's kind of how Kentucky was able to exist as a border state. They people like take Greenup County, for example. Greenup County had 800 troops that fought in the Civil War. All 800 fought for the Union. And yet, you can go drive down the street and see a Confederate flag today in 2024.
Yeah, but I live in Pennsylvania. You see Confederate flags here all the time.
And it's one of those things that, I think it's, and you see like the "Don't Tread on Me" flags, which I think those are, this message of like pushing against government involvement, and the ironies of all these different things. But it's kind of this phenomenon of, and I'm exploring this a little bit in my master's thesis, this phenomenon of how, people's thinking can be really affected by what they see, and what they hear others say, even if those things don't match reality at all. As we're seeing,
community.
So yeah, it's which I love Kentucky dearly, and I want Kentucky to work for everyone, and I think
I love it more and more as I get older. And now that I've been around the world, Jenny has lived in LA for many, many decades, but is from here. And but I am so happy to be back. And I think going away, I appreciate it more coming back. You had a question.
I did, and it's going to totally change the subject. I hope that you guys don't mind.
That's okay.
My name's Jenny Marshall, and I'm an educational therapist in Los Angeles, and I teach a bunch of little geniuses. But I can say that writing across the board is their least favorite thing to do. And I'm just really curious about what age you were when you really fell in love with writing, and then how the people around you supported that.
I'd probably say elementary school age is when I really, started putting little stories together. As I talked about sci-fi and fantasy, the first little stories I put together were about dragons flying around and whatever. But now things I put together are about, much more contemporary and relevant. And I definitely tend towards realistic fiction more than anything else these days. Or at least realistic fiction with kind of a little twist in it, perhaps. But so I grew up with my mom being the school librarian at the elementary school that I went to school with.
Well, that's going to give you if your
right.
mom's a librarian,
So I kind of had the life of, if I knew of a new book coming out that I wanted to read, we'd go buy it, I'd read it, and then she'd put it in the library. And they could use funds for that and all the different stuff. And I spent a lot of my childhood making AR tests, if you know what those are, like the accelerated reader test for, I still do that.
That's why I didn't know what it was. I was never an accelerated reader.
But like where I went to elementary school, you had to have like a certain number of points each, I guess, school year or term. And a larger book would be worth more points and all those things. and I would always just try to have the most one spot. I think reading and writing go hand in hand. You can't do one without the other. And so, I kind of had that early on, that fascination with stories and reading, and that kind of just turned into appreciation for writing as well, and kind of sharing my stories, and then, coming up with stories, and realizing, what stories people will value and why, and those things. So
And I'm gonna
Thank
let you.
Thank you.
I would love for you to give us another sampling of On Low Gap Road, which, Kristin, would you hold it up again?
But it's backwards when I hold it up.
Oh yeah, On Low Gap
When
Road.
he holds it up,
Kyle
it's
Alvey.
forwards. How did you do that?
I think when I hold it up, it's
I think
backwards.
it's fine.
No,
think-
it's forwards when you hold it up.
It looks good. Okay, so anyway, that is our book, and it's Rabbit House Press, one of Rabbit House Press latest poetry collections. We also put out Elizabeth Beck's Dancing on the Page, and you can get both at rabbithousepress.com. And so Kyle, yeah, we'd love for you to, I'm gonna make you the main person right now and mute us. And if you would grant us with another little bit, we'd love it.
Yep. Okay. So I will read one poem called A Reflection, and then I'll read one of the vignettes at the end. And I'll talk about vignettes in a second. All right, so A Reflection. When I hear the titles Mama and Papa, I am immediately transported back to Low Gap Road. I vividly remember large pieces of my childhood. I remember them and their voices. I remember the way they chose to live, surrounding themselves with family and hard work. I remember their hands and their eyes. I remember nights spent in bunk beds. I remember mornings at the kitchen table. I remember casting a reel into their pond. I remember walking in the garden. I remember wiping dust and grime from bits and ends scattered across the farm. I remember seeing snakes and dogs. I remember driving down the gravel driveway. I remember sitting in the swing. I remember walking up to get the mail. I remember being all together to watch TV. I remember cleaning dishes. I remember sneaking ice cream. I remember being awake late at night. I remember afternoon naps. I remember who they were. I remember where I come from, and I know who I come from and can guess on the why. And so then I put at the end a few vignettes. And so a vignette is just a very, very brief, I kind of consider it sort of similar to like a microfiction. But a vignette needs to have, in order to be a vignette, not just to be a really, really short story, it needs to have a very prominent theme. So something that it's exploring, that's obvious from the title, and then you're not disguising it, you're just really digging into it. So one of the assignments that I have students do is do a little vignette personal narrative collection. And they, this year, for example, when I first started talking about vignettes, they accused me of making something up, and they were like, Alvey, this isn't a thing. And I'm like, yes, it is. We're going to do this. And I think by the time we finished that assignment, they really had liked it, because it's, which I just finished reading Stephen King's new collection of short stories. And he says in the intro or I guess at the end, he talks about how short fiction is actually harder than writing his novels, and I definitely agree with that to an extent. But I also think short fiction is a little freer, because you have less constraints. You're not trying to do as much, but you have the exact same tools that you have when you're writing long things. All right, so this one is called I Can Always Go See It. It is late afternoon, the beginning of May. I turn 27 in less than a week. I have just finished the school day. It was a good day. The students and I are in good spirits since the school year is rapidly drawing to a close. It has been a tough year, but extremely rewarding. My first in a high school classroom as the one in charge. I can still feel the exhaustion that will take some time to go away. I'm getting dinner with my mother tonight, but she's busy in the meantime. I have time to kill. As I drive down US 23, I make a decision. I turn right onto Route 2. This road is one of the curviest I have ever been on. It winds round and round, following Appalachian remnants beside the Little Sandy. I turn up Sweet Emotion by Aerosmith. I turn left onto Low Gap Road. I drive along a steep curve, and then Mama and Papa's house comes into view. The pond shimmers in the sunlight that still has several hours yet. The house sits quietly. I turn and park at the top of the long gravel driveway. I sit for a moment, remembering many things, but still in the context of my day at school. I think of what they would say if they knew I was teaching in the same school they closed out their own teaching careers. I wistfully think about what they would say if they could be here beside me, knowing all that I know. I think about how I could stop here anytime I wished, simply to remember. I back out of the driveway and head towards home, switching over to a podcast. I let myself fall into the news stories they are discussing and keep driving away from the past. But I look back in the rearview mirror, and I always will.
Oh, thank you so much. That was beautiful. And that's exactly what it is, looking back in the rearview mirror and honoring them. And you know they're with you now. And so proud of this beautiful collection. And we're so proud to have been able to publish it. So thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Kyle. Anybody have
Thank you
any
so
last
much.
Yes,
questions?
thank you so much. That was beautiful.
Thank
Okay,
you.
so what are you doing next? What are you going to do next? You're still obviously kind of rolling this book out. It just came out a couple months ago.
Yeah, so right now I'm kind of working on two different projects. One is a collection of Appalachian-based fantasy stories.
Mhm.
And so, the Appalachian Mountains are like some of the oldest mountains in the world. So I'm kind of taking this concept of they were not formed naturally. I'll just say that. They were put in place to keep something there.
I feel like there's a monster involved, like maybe Bigfoot or,
Mothman. There are several. There are several
what's it, a
things.
Sasquatch,
Yeah.
the abominable snowman. He's
Any number of that are out and about. Probably one of my favorite things that I've come up with. I don't know if you they're in Harry Potter, but they were something else before. I can't think what they're called, but they would lure people into. I think they're an Irish myth. They would lure people into like a swampy area with like a lantern. You'd hear music, and then you'd
Oh yeah.
leprechauns.
Leprechauns, like a little
Or the sirens.
or yes,
the little
but I have something similar to that where it's like they hear fiddle music and they lure you out into them and then you disappear. So it's
yeah.
kind
That
of
was
playing around with some of these cryptids and playing around with some of these ideas. My other project that I'm working on, even though both of these things are probably going to have to be shelved here soon as I start working on my history thesis.
that would
Um,
be very interesting.
Yeah, that
but
will be interesting.
so this other project is I'm kind of trying to put together a prequel novel to The Great Gatsby about Daisy living in Louisville.
Oh wow.
Wow.
Is that where
And
she was from?
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Uh, and,
Okay.
and so um
Yes.
so that's kind of where I
Interesting.
pretty early into it, but I do have it all outlined and I have started the first draft.
Wow. That will be
Yeah,
very
I can't wait to read that. That'll be
yes.
turn it into a movie.
Yeah, that does sound like a movie. Who gets to play Daisy?
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't know she was from Louisville. I'd missed that part, but that's totally cool.
Yeah, I think The Great Gatsby, I think it just not name drops Louisville just like one time.
Wow.
Um but yeah, and then F. Scott Fitzgerald loved visiting Louisville. And there were can't think what I don't know if it's the Brown Hotel or if it's a different one, but there's some hotel in downtown Louisville that has like the F. Scott Fitzgerald suite, and that's where he would like.
I stay as a writer in residence. I have a few times at Weymouth Center for the Arts and Humanities in Southern Pines, North Carolina. And it was James Boyd's house. And he was very close to Thomas Wolfe and F. Scott Fitzgerald. And so there's the Max Perkins room and the Scott Fitzgerald room and the Zelda room. But that's a wonderful place if you ever make it to North Carolina. And to do. I just one more question and we have to wrap it up, but I wanted to ask you if you ever do writers residencies, if you've ever considered going to Yaddo or McDowell or one of the famous places.
I know I need to do it. I haven't done one yet, but it's definitely been so I have done kind of some writing retreats like at different people's cabins and other such things, but like I haven't done like an official one like through an institution.
It's
But I
really, I
def-
think you would love it because, you know, the fact of going there, everybody's on their own writing, and then you kind of come as a community and you meet other people at dinner, and then you go back to, you know, your own hall to create. It's some of the best experiences I've ever had, and finish that book there. But anyway, thank you for our guest.
Thank you. Oh, thanks.
Thank you, Kristin.
Thank you for having me.
And you will, and Kyle, thank you so much. And
Yeah, thanks, Kyle.
good
Thank you.
luck with the book. And we will keep, it will always be on our bookshelves at Rabbit House Press. And anybody that needs a copy can go to rabbithousepress.com or go to Amazon and write a review. You know, get your book at Amazon and write a review, because that always helps the author. So all right, you all.
Thank you,
Have
guys.
a great time.
Nice to meet
and
you.
Nice to meet you. Thank you so much, Kyle.
Nice to meet you.
All right. Bye
Bye,
bye.
everybody.
Bye.